Hey guys, it's Sam, and this is my 2018 reading and reading goals wrap-up. If you guys are looking for my favorite books of the year, that's a separate video. I will link that on the screen. This is all of my pretty stats and stuff, and talking about the goals that I had at the beginning of 2018 and if I achieved them or not. So this is my first year that I actually recorded all my reading in a spreadsheet. I use the spreadsheet from Portal in the Pages. I will link her spreadsheet for 2018 down below. I'm filming this on New Year's Eve, so she hasn't posted her 2019 one yet. I think she usually does it like New Year's Eve or New Year's Day and then posts it later on. So I will be using hers again if she posts one. Fingers crossed, because I really enjoyed using it. So this was a really efficient way, because she had it already set up, to track a bunch of things about my reading, and I just found it really fun and fulfilling, more so than entering something on Goodreads, because it doesn't give you all the pretty stats. I'm not necessarily a numbers person, but I'm a gamer. And so I like seeing that kind of stuff because it feels like I'm hitting achievements, you know? I like that. So as far as the number that everyone seems to care about, my goal for the year for number of books I wanted to get read was 52. 52 weeks in the year, 52 books. That's a pretty standard goal for a lot of people, and I did achieve that. I read 60 books this year. This is probably the least amount of books that I've ever read since being on BookTube, but as you guys know, because I never ceased to forget to tell you, I was in graduate school, I was really busy, I was moving, I had different jobs. 2018 was a rough year, so the fact that I got over 52 was great, because at some point, I think mid-year, I was like, is this gonna happen? I don't know if this is gonna happen. But it did. My average star rating this year was 3.4 stars, which I actually really love. It's slightly over half, in my opinion. I know it would technically be 2.5, but I don't want to rate a lot of things 1 and 2 stars. I think the majority of things should be 3 stars, because that's just kind of the nature of things, 3 and 4 stars, and that's kind of how the bell curve should kind of go, in my opinion. So I was really happy with the star rating, and I think that feels right. So 10 of the books that I read this year were 5 stars, 19 were 4 stars, 22 were 3 stars, 5 were 2 stars, and 4 were 1 stars. I will be doing my most disappointing reads of the year video, so those 2 and 1 stars will be showing up on that. The average amount of time that a book spent on my TBR before I read it was 9 months. Now, that's an interesting number for me because in 2019, I'm going to focus a lot more on my TBR. So I'll be talking more about that in a separate video where I'll be doing my 2019 reading goals. But that's a number I wanted to kind of keep in mind. So as far as genres, this will come as no surprise. 63% of the books that I read were fantasy. So 38 of the books that I read were fantasy. Not shocked. 20% of the books that I read were science fiction. So 12 of them. This one I'm excited about because I definitely feel like I do lean more fantasy heavy, but I feel like I read a lot more sci-fi than I have in previous years. I haven't tracked my reading in this kind of way with a spreadsheet like this, so I don't actually know if that's true, but it feels like I did more sci-fi this year, and that makes me happy. I only read 1 contemporary book this year, which I think was really interesting. I think in previous years I tend to read at least 5, and I only read 1. I'm kind of happy with that. And I think that's because I was so focused for most of the year on reading books that I was pretty sure I was going to like, that I just read mostly sci-fi and fantasy, because I don't tend to love contemporary. So even though it's quicker for me to read, I didn't really focus on it because I was focusing on the sci-fi and fantasy that I was pretty sure I would like. 70% of the books that I read were on physical copy, and 30% were audiobook. So I did a lot of audiobook reading this year. As far as age genres, I don't know what we technically age categories for the books that I read, 48% were adult and 48% were YA. And then that random 3% was a couple middle grade books that I read. So basically 50-50. Essentially half and half, which I really like. I was surprised. I think towards the end of the year I started to read a lot more YA, and that's when I was reading a lot more as well, because I just wanted to read as much as possible, and so I was reading books that I knew were quicker. So I think if I would have continued on the trend of what I was reading for the majority of the year, it would have skewed a little more adult, but I like my reading to at least be 50-50 YA adult, not more YA than adult. If anything, I would like more adult than YA. So it being 50-50 or more skewed towards adult is good and my preference. As far as the authors, 75% of them were women, which I'm not shocked about because I tend to read women, and 73% were white. So I tended to read white women. That has kind of always been what happens because white women dominate the YA genre, but also tend to dominate the fantasy that I read as well. So as far as my more specific goals, I had 4 of them and then an annual TBR, which I'll get to at the very end. The first goal was to read at least half of the 52 books, so 26 books that I already owned as of January 1st, 2018. So that was my way of trying to get some books off of my physical TBR. I said at the beginning of 2018 that I wanted to focus more on my physical TBR, but that I kind of figured that I wouldn't really be able to in the way that I wanted to in 2018 based on how busy I was. So I wanted to have at least half of the books that I read be books from my physical TBR that I already owned. And I read 24 books that I had already owned as of January 1st. So I'm very, very close. I'm not going to beat myself up for it. I actually, if I would have finished the book that I'm reading now, it would have been 25. Like, I was so close, and I feel like that's a success based on the fact that, like, some months I only read one book. My second goal was to read books within 6 months of getting them. Now, I didn't have any kind of punishment for myself if I didn't do that because, again, I knew how busy I was going to be and that like, I didn't want to put the kind of pressure on myself last year, so I didn't stick to this, like, in a hard, concrete way. But I still did pretty well. So of the 53 books that I got in 2018, 24 of them I read within 2018. Almost half, very close to half. And that also I feel like is a big success considering all of the things that were going on in 2018. My third goal was that I wanted to try the grimdark fantasy genre, and I achieved that for sure with the Book of the Ancestors series by Mark Lawrence. Mark Lawrence is a very well-known grimdark author, so that's for sure grimdark. And then also, I believe a little bit with the Queens of Innis Lear by Tessa Gratton. This isn't specific. It's hard to tell with grimdark, like where do things fall, but this feels very, very close to grimdark, if not grimdark. It's not as grim as it could be, but it's pretty grim. My last goal was to read 4 space operas because space opera is my favorite subgenre within science fiction, although I discovered a new one this year, being New Weird, which I want to read more of. I'm not making that a specific goal for myself. Maybe I should, I don't know. But New Weird is another one that I really like, but space opera is like the reigning subgenre for me in sci-fi. And I did manage to do this. So I read Sleeping Giants and Waking Gods by Sylvain Neuvel. These are borderline, like I wasn't quite sure if these counted as space operas, but in my head they do. They have that like space opera feel, even though a lot of it is happening on Earth, but there's also all of this stuff with space being talked about. So I counted them, even though like they might not technically count for a lot of people because it's not like, they were really borderline. I mean, you have like giant alien space bots. Like, that feels space opera to me. So it might not technically count to some people, but I'm counting it. Then I read Caliban's War by James S.A. Corey, a for sure space opera, and Morning Star by Pierce Brown. And lastly, I want to talk about my TBR. So at the beginning of 2018, I started with 83 books on my physical TBR. I unhauled 27 books, but that number might be a little fuzzy because there were some books that I counted as unhauling at some point when I was like tallying everything up that I never really put on my TBR, but like, yeah, so as I was getting things and deciding if I was going to keep them, some things like got lost in the shuffle, so I'm not sure if the math is going to add up on this exactly. But right now I have 69 books on my physical TBR. Now 2 of those might get removed because I talked about them in my last unhaul of the year. There are 2 that I'm on the fence about that a lot of people left very polarizing comments on my video where it was like kind of trash my TBR. So I'm going to end up, when I finish reading the current book, reading like the first chapter of both of those books and seeing if I want to keep them or not. So I could start 2019 technically with 67, or I could start with 69. So not as big of a chunk as I would have liked to have put in my TBR, but a significant chunk for how busy I was. And like I said, I got a lot of the books that I was reading read within 6 months of getting them, and yeah, there's a lot of good things that happened as far as my TBR, but this was not a year that I could have focused on my TBR the way that I would have liked to. And for the past few years, I've also done an annual TBR, so I decided at the beginning of the year 12 books that I want to read. This year, I broke it into 6-month parts, so I did one in January with 6 books, and I did one in June or July with 6 books, so that I was putting books on my annual TBR that I wanted to get read quickly, that I was excited about right then, because I found that in 2017 when I did this, I lost interest in some of those books as the year went on because new things kind of took precedent for me. So I split it into the 6-month time blocks, and I really enjoyed that. So I had a few from the beginning of the year that crossed over until the end of the year TBR, and I didn't hit all of them, so I read 9 of the 12, which I'm happy about, but I didn't get to all of them. So the 3 that I did not read was The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, which I started but ended up putting down. I'm unsure if this is going to be a DNF. I do think I want to read it, but I am not very compelled to pick it back up. Nevernight by Jay Kristoff, which I've mentioned before, I mostly didn't read because people kept bothering me to read it, and you know how that goes. And The 12 Kings of Shirakai by Bradley Baleo, which was one that I really wanted to get to, but is very large. So will those books end up on my 2019 annual TBR? You guys will have to wait and see. I have a few things that I've observed from doing this annual TBR. I like breaking them up like I did into the 6-month blocks. I think that's good. I'm thinking maybe decreasing my annual TBR actually, because I do find that once I put it on there, one, my brain almost thinks of it as already read, even though that's not true. And two, it puts some kind of like weird pressure on me when I have this like big annual TBR. So I'm not sure I'm going to morph that a bit. I think I might decrease it and also just kind of change something up about it yet, but I haven't quite decided what that is yet. And also I noticed that I put a lot of very large books on my annual TBR, and I think that makes it very intimidating for myself. I mean, there's a lot of books that are very large. They're typically large science fiction or fantasy books that I really want to get read and that I've been putting off, so I put them on an annual TBR, whatever the case may be, or I'm just excited, whatever. I just tend to want to read large fantasy and science fiction books, but I also find that very intimidating when my entire annual TBR is very large, very dense science fiction and fantasy books. So I kind of have to think about what I'm going to do for my 2019 goals. But I am going to hold on to the annual TBR and be talking about the books that I want to read within 2019 as well. So that is it for my 2018 reading goal wrap up. I had a pretty decent reading year for how little time I had to read, but I definitely think that I was just kind of surviving in a lot of ways 2018, and reading was the same way. Like my reading life was just like trying to survive. So I definitely hope that 2019 is going to be a better year. I already kind of predict that it's going to be as far as a reading year for me, so I'm looking forward to kind of comparing at the end of 2019 how it went. But I will be posting my 2019 reading goals very soon, so you'll get to see my 2019 reading goals and TBR goals and all of that. So look forward to that if you like these kinds of videos like I do. But comment below, let me know how your 2018 reading year went and if you had any goals, if you achieved them or not. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.